The arena was full of light and sound, and the air shook with the voices of 1,000 alien species, all cheering and laughing and shouting as they waited for the next fight to begin. And in the center stood Commander Viral Tall, and strong with silver skin and armor that glowed with power, and beside her was a human, the only one from Earth, the one called Lieutenant Jacob Price. Viral looked down at Jacob with a wide grin, her sharp teeth shining under the lights of the stadium, and she pointed at the object in his hands, a small metal box no bigger than her head, and she threw back her head and laughed loud, and long her voice booming through the sky dome and echoing through the crowd. "Is this your weapon, little human?" she said in a voice full of pride and mockery. "Is this the best your kind can bring to our grand challenge? It looks like a child's toy, not a warrior's tool." And she stepped forward, raising her axe, a weapon longer than Jacob's body, with a blade that shimmered with blue heat. Jacob said nothing. He only bent down and placed a metal object on the floor of the arena, and then he stepped back calm and quiet his face without fear, and the crowd roared with more laughter. Some even shouted insults and jokes about Earth and its small, weak people. A screen above the arena showed images of Viral's past victories, flashes of her crushing her enemies, throwing them across the ring, and smashing their weapons like sticks, and next to her image was Jacob's file, a short list of missions, and no wins in the arena, and the crowd believed this fight would be quick and easy. The host of the match, a tall creature with glowing eyes, raised his hand, and the lights dimmed as he shouted the rules, and reminded everyone that this was a test of strength and honor, and once the signal was given there would be no mercy and no turning back. The signal flashed, and Viral leapt forward, her axe raised high, and the crowd held its breath, ready for the fight to end in seconds. But just before her foot hit the ground near Jacob, the metal object blinked a single red light, soft at first, then brighter and faster, and the arena grew silent for a moment as the blinking turned into a steady pulse. Viral slowed her step and looked down, her grin fading and her eyes narrowing, and she tilted her head and asked in a low voice, "What is that thing?" Jacob still said nothing, his eyes locked on the device, and his fingers moved behind his back, tapping a small code into the wristband hidden under his sleeve. The crowd leaned in, their eyes wide as the blinking light turned blue, then green, and then the ground beneath the object began to vibrate and shake. From high above in the control tower, a technician gasped and called over his commander, telling him something was rising from beneath the arena floor, something that was not part of the arena systems, and it was old and human-made. Back in the arena, Viral took another step back, her axe still raised, but her hands no longer steady, and the noise of the crowd turned from laughter to whispers and questions, and then to silence as a deep hum filled the air like the voice of a giant waking from sleep. The ground split with a slow crack, and steam poured out from below, and the blinking object lifted into the air, floating without wires or wings, and small panels opened on its sides, revealing strange lights and symbols that no one in the crowd had seen before. Jacob finally spoke, his voice clear and quiet. "This is not a toy," he said. "It is a key. A key to what?" Viral asked, her voice no longer full of pride. "To something you should have never laughed at," he answered. And as he said those words, a crack in the floor widened, and something began to rise, a shape made of dark metal with eyes that burned like fire and limbs thick as pillars, and the crowd gasped, and many stood up and shouted, and others ran from their seats as the machine rose higher and higher. Viral stepped back again, her axe now shaking in her grip, and her face pale as the full shape came into view, and the light from the arena reflected off the smooth arm of the thing that stood behind the human like a shadow of death. The host tried to speak, but his voice failed, and the technician in the control room sent emergency codes across the Union network, calling for lockdown and scans and more ships, but no one could stop what had already begun. Jacob turned to face the machine, and it lowered its head as if bowing to him, and then it looked at Viral, and the crowd knew in that moment that the fight was not what they thought it was. This was not a battle between a proud alien warrior and a weak human. This was a warning, and the real challenge was just beginning. Hours before the crowd filled the grand arena, hours before the earth beneath it cracked open and the sky, filled with fear, the halls of the Galactic Union shimmered with gold and glass, and light flowing like rivers in the air, and within those halls sat the high council of the Cernak proud warriors from the fire moons of Shurak Prime, known across the stars for their victories and strength, and in the center of them stood Commander Viral Tall and proud, her arms crossed and her silver armor glowing softly with lines of ancient energy. The council chamber was silent except for the hum of the floating orbs that recorded every word, every movement, and every breath, and behind Viral stood her advisors, warriors who had fought beside her through blood and fire, and all of them stared at the screen on the wall, where a figure appeared small and alone and human. Lieutenant Jacob Price was standing before the main gate holding a single case in one hand and wearing nothing more than a simple gray suit, without armor, without guards, without fear, and a room filled with laughter not cruel, but amused, as if watching a child walk into a storm. "This is a human," they said. One of the council members said, his voice deep and slow. "They call him a soldier, but he carries no blade and no shield. What does he think he will do with that box?" Viral smiled and waved her hand to silence them. She had seen humans before in past missions, quiet people small in frame, always using tools and machines instead of true strength, and she never feared them, never respected them, and today she would prove once and for all that Earth did not belong at the table of warriors. "Send him in," she said. "I will speak to him myself." Jacob entered the chamber, walking calmly through the golden doors past guards with axes and armor and flames carved into their helmets, and he did not blink when one of them hissed in his ear or when another spat near his feet. He simply walked to the center of the room, placed the box gently on the floor, and looked at Viral with calm eyes. "You are brave to come here alone," she said, "or foolish. Either way it will make a good show in the arena." "I am here to represent Earth," Jacob said, his voice firm and clear. "We were invited to the Union, and we accepted, and I was sent to speak, and if needed to stand." "You will not stand for long," she replied, her grin wide and sharp. "This is not a place for words, little man. It is a place for proof, and the only proof that matters is strength." "Then let strength speak," Jacob said, and he stepped back from the box, as if offering it to the room. The council leaned forward, eyes glowing, weapons humming with interest, as Viral walked in a slow circle around the box, looking down at it, as if expected to open or move or even speak. But it did nothing, only sat there silent and still and small. "This is what you bring," she asked the box. "What is it meant to do? Store your pride." "It is meant to be ready," Jacob answered, and that was all he said. More laughter filled the room, this time louder and full of echoes that bounced off the crystal walls, and even the guards chuckled behind their masks, and one of the council members stood and declared, "I will bet my warship that this human falls in 5 seconds." 5 seconds is generous," another said. "I give him 2. Viral raised her hand, and the room fell quiet. Once more she looked Jacob in the eye and said, "Then let us test your little toy in the arena. At sunset, you will face me before the eyes of the galaxy, and when you fall, no one will ever forget it." Jacob nodded once and picked up the box's grip, gentle, like someone holding a living thing. And without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving behind silence and stares and one quiet question hanging in the air. What if the box is not what it seems? In the chambers below the arena, Viral, prepared for the fight, her armor was cleaned and sharpened, her axe polished until the blade glowed blue, and her guard stood ready with her cloak of victory draped across her shoulders. She stretched and trained and smiled as she imagined the look on the human's face when the fight began and ended with one strike, and she remembered his eyes, not afraid, not proud, just steady, and that made her pause for a moment, but only a moment. Outside, the sun began to fall, and the arena filled with light and sound and eyes from every corner of the galaxy, waiting to see the proud Cernak crush the quiet human from Earth. And in a small room just beneath the platform, Jacob sat alone, the box beside him, and his fingers tapped a silent code into the device hidden in his sleeve, and for the first time since arriving, he allowed himself a small smile, not a pride, not a joy, but a memory. He remembered Earth, not the cities or the sky, but the labs deep below the ground where engineers whispered of old machines built not to fight, but to end fights, where secrets were buried in metal and silence, and where he was chosen not because he was strong, but because he would never speak unless the moment truly demanded it. And now the moment had come. The arena shook with sound as the great walls opened and the crowd leaned forward, hungry for blood, hungry for noise and glory, and the chance to see a human fail beneath the boot of the Cernak's champion. And as the two warriors stepped onto the smooth stone floor, the sky above them swirled with banners from every system in the Galactic Union, all flickering with colors and symbols that danced like fire in the windless dome. On one side stood Commander Viral, her silver armor gleaming under the lights, her weapon a giant axe pulsing with energy, her stance wide and sure, and her eyes locked on her prey with a hunger that had never known defeat, her breath calm and deep as her muscles tense with quiet joy. On the other side stood Lieutenant Jacob Price, smaller than his opponent, wearing only a light armored vest and dark trousers, and in his right hand was nothing but the same small metal box that he had carried since he arrived at Surface Dull and plain with no sign of power or purpose. And the crowd once again laughed as the match announcer shouted his name in 10 languages, most of them laced with mockery. They called him Earth Mouse. They called him the Walking Loss. They called him human, who forgets to bring a weapon. Yet Jacob stood there without flinching, without blinking, his face unreadable and his steps measured as he walked slowly toward the center of the arena, where the two combatants were meant to bow. But Viral did not bow. She raised her axe and pointed it at his chest, and her voice thundered across the stone walls. "You may still walk away if you wish, little one," she said. "The crowd may be disappointed, but at least your people will not have to clean your remains from this sacred floor." Jacob looked at her for a long moment. Then he knelt and placed the metal box on the ground, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with something strange, something almost reverent. And when he stood again, he stepped away from it slowly, like someone waking a beast in its sleep. He gave no answer. He simply waited. A horn sounded the signal to begin the duel, and the crowd roared, and Viral charged forward like lightning wrapped in steel, her axe raised above her head with both hands, ready to strike with all the force of her ancestors behind her, and the wind from her charge sent dust flying behind her in wide circles. Jacob stood still. The box blinked. The first light was red. The blade of her axe moved downward with a terrible howl, and the edge hummed as it sliced the air on its way toward Jacob's skull. But just before the impact, the box blinked again, and the second light was green, and then the air itself bent. There was no explosion, no sound, no flash. Instead, there was stillness, and then a hum so low it shook bones and made vision blur. The ground beneath Jacob cracked like thin ice, and the stones moved in strange patterns, forming symbols that shimmered in blue and white. And then something below answered. Viral felt at first her steps slowed, her balance shifted, and the swing missed by inches, not because Jacob moved, but because the floor moved and the metal box now hovered an inch above the ground, spinning slowly as light poured from its seams. The crowd had stopped laughing. The sensors in the control tower screamed with alerts, and one of the technicians gasped when his screen showed a heat signature rising from below the arena, a shape buried deep, but not asleep, and marked with human code older than the Union itself and stronger than anything listed in Earth's military records. Viral backed up confused, not afraid, not yet, but uncertain for the first time, and she looked at the box, and then at Jacob, and she asked again, her voice now quiet, "What is that thing?" Jacob looked at her, and his lips moved just enough to say 3 words. "It is listening." The box blinked again, this time with a light so bright it cast shadows across the entire arena, and the floor beneath it opened in 4 directions, like a great flower made of stone and steam, and from the depths rose a shape of impossible scale, a machine taller, and the arena walls broader than a shuttle transports arms, like towers, its head like a mountain carved with runes and eyes of molten light. The arena fell silent. Even the announcer had lost his voice. The machine climbed slowly, its steps shaking the ground, and its hands gripping the ledges, as it pulled itself into the daylight for the first time in a century, and behind its armor were scars from old battles, deep and long and glowing faintly with energy that refused to die. It looked at Jacob first, and its head bowed slightly. Then it turned to Viral. She raised her axe again, her grip tighter, her pride forcing her forward, but her feet moved slower, and her heart pounded in her ears. The machine spoke with a voice that came from every speaker and every stone and every metal surface in the arena, a voice ancient and clear and without emotion. Combat protocol active. Target identified. Defense mode engaged. Jacob stepped to the side, his hands behind his back, and his face still calm. The machine moved forward, and with each step the ground cracked more, and the lights above flickered, and the crowd began to panic, some running for the exits, others frozen in their seats, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes only when something beyond understanding enters the world. Viral swung her axe blade, connected with the arm of the machine, and the strike sent sparks flying, but the arm did not move, it did not dent, it did not even feel. The machine reached out and grabbed the axe mid-swing, and with one slow movement, it crushed the weapon into glowing dust, letting the fragments fall to the floor like broken stars. Viral stumbled back, her eyes wide, her breath shallow, and for the first time in her life, she stepped away from an opponent without meaning to. Jacob's voice reached her again, calm and steady. "You wanted strength. Now you have seen ours." The crowd was silent now, no more cheers, no more jokes, and even the banners above seemed to dim as the wind that did not exist moved through the arena like a whisper. The machine stepped back and returned to the circle in the center, and the box slowly lowered itself to the ground again, closing its panels and returning to silence. Viral looked at Jacob, and her voice was barely more than a whisper. "What are you?" Jacob looked back at her and gave no answer, because in that moment the silence was stronger than any word he could give. The dust had not yet settled in the arena, and the windless dome held the weight of silence as the last flickers of blue light faded from the great machine's armor, and still it stood there behind the human, its frame towering like a forgotten god returned to walk among mortals. And though its limbs had not moved since crushing Viral's axe, there was not a soul in the crowd who believed it was done. Above the arena, the control tower was a hive of panic screens blinking red and blue as officers shouted over one another, sending warnings to ships in orbit and to Union security forces stationed on the moon gates. And still nothing came through, nothing made sense, because what they were seeing had no record in any database, and its energy signature was too high to measure. The technician in charge of threat levels a Cernak male named Reza with 4 eyes and long fingers move his trembling hand toward the emergency override the button that would lock down the entire arena and call an orbital strike craft, but a superior grabbed his wrist and shook his head slowly, eyes never leaving the screen where the human still stood calm and quiet beside the sleeping monster. "We do not fire on something we do not understand," he said, and his voice carried more fear than logic. Back in the arena, Viral had not spoken. She stared at the machine with breath held, chest heaving, muscles tense, and uncertain, her fingers twitching where her weapon had once been, and now only empty air remained. The crushed remains of her axe lay like ash around her boots, and even her armor, which had never once cracked, now hummed with warning lights and low-power signals. Jacob turned to face her, and his voice broke the silence, clear and even. "You laughed at our toy." He gestured to the box, now closed again, its lights dim, its shell harmless once more. "That was your first mistake." Viral narrowed her eyes. Her pride, not yet broken her, will not yet surrendered, but inside her mind memories moved of old stories, old warnings about Earth, not the stories they told in the Union, of a weak world full of farmers and engineers, but the whispers of ones passed between warriors over campfires about a planet that never fought to win, but only fought to finish. "Tell me what that is," she said, and her voice cracked for just a moment. Jacob looked up at the machine, and his eyes reflected its burning core, and he said slowly and without pride, "It is one of our guardians. One of many. A long time ago, before the Union, before your kind came to our solar system, Earth faced a war that nearly ended our kind, and so we built them not to fight our battles, but to end them before they could begin. You see, Viral, our weapons do not roar with glory. Our soldiers do not shout their victories into the stars, because we do not care about honor. We care about survival. We care about peace. And when that peace is threatened, we bring the storm." The machine turned its head toward the crowd, now its eyes scanning each face, each species, each flag, and its voice came again, not loud, but deep enough to shake the walls. "Monitoring threat levels. No hostile intent detected. Returning to passive mode." Its chest opened slightly, revealing coils of energy and circuits that flowed like rivers of fire, then closed again as it lowered one knee to the ground and folded its arms across its plated chest. A Cernak elder in the first row fell to his seat, unable to breathe, his face pale, and his eyes full of memories of old wars of machines that had no name and of humans who never asked for permission, only forgiveness. "This cannot be one of them," he whispered to no one and everyone. "Those were destroyed." Jacob turned to the crowd and spoke for the first time to all of them, his voice soft, but heard by every soul in the arena. "You believe we were weak because we stayed silent. You believe we were harmless because we brought only one man in one box. But that is how Earth works. We let others speak of power. We let others parade their fire. And then we bring a whisper that can burn stars." Viral stepped forward, slow and heavy, each step loud in the silence, and she looked into the face of the machine, and then at Jacob, and she said with a voice full of something rare for her, "Respect. I do not understand your world, and I do not understand your machines, but I see now that I was wrong. You are not prey. You are not children. You are the shadow that waits at the edge of war, and when it moves, all other shadows vanish." Jacob gave no reply. He walked to the box, knelt beside it, and pressed his hand to its surface, and it shimmered once, then clicked open a small drawer, and inside was a piece of stone etched with symbols glowing faintly in red. He took it and held it high. "This is our symbol of warning," he said. "We place it only when we are asked to show what we keep beneath the soil of our peace. Let it stand as a sign, not of threat, but of patience, because this time we chose not to finish. The machine behind him rose again and walked back toward the open space where the floor had split, and as it stepped into the pit, the ground closed above its, stone sliding over stone until not a trace remained except for the lines burned into the arena floor in a shape that matched no known language, but somehow carried meaning into every watching mind. The crowd did not cheer. They stood in silence as Jacob picked up the box and walked toward the edge of the arena, the same way he had walked into it, slow, calm, measured, and without looking back. Vera remained where she stood, eyes locked on the place where the machine had vanished, and her shoulders heavy not with defeat, but with the weight of truth. In the control tower, the technician Rezer turned off the threat alarm slowly, then whispered to his superior, "How many of those things do you think they have?" The superior answered without hesitation, "Enough. Enough to end all of us if we ever forget again that silence is not weakness." And across the galaxy, in every system where the fight had been streamed and watched and mocked and laughed at, new orders were being written, new treaties reviewed, and new fears born not of the Earth itself, but of what Earth chose not to show. Because now the galaxy had seen it, not the weapon, but the will to wait before using it. Smoke lingered in the corners of the arena, and the scent of ozone mixed with dust and silence as the last echoes of the machine's voice faded into memory, and still Viral stood there staring at the ground that had swallowed the monster and wondering how close she had come to death without even knowing it, and how far the human had let her go before pulling back the curtain. Around her the crowd had yet to speak, as if words were too weak to carry the weight of what they had witnessed, and the banners that once waved with color now hung still like the breath of every living soul had been stolen away by the very shadow that had passed before them. Above the arena, the control tower remained darkened and quiet, and the officers there watched Jacob leave the ring step by step with the metal box once again in hand, and their minds raced with questions that had no answers and fears they could not speak aloud, because the rules of war had changed in a single moment. Viral lowered her eyes and exhaled slowly, her chest still shaking from what she had seen, not the machine's strength, not the crushing of her axe or the quake beneath her feet, but the look in Jacob's eyes, that calm, steady gaze that never wavered even as a titan rose behind him and pointed itself at her, like a question, with only one answer. She remembered how the machine had not attacked, not until she had moved, not until her weapon had threatened, and even then it had not aimed to kill, only to end the fight. And that single restraint burned hotter in her memory than all her years of training, because it spoke of a kind of power that did not need to prove itself. Jacob had not fought. He had waited. He had endured her mocking, her challenge, her rage, and then answered not with words, but with the reminder that Earth did not send warriors to win applause, it sent guardians to end wars before they began. She turned away from the center of the arena, and the crowd slowly parted for her, no one reaching out, no one daring to speak, and her guards followed behind her, uncertain whether they should stay close or give space, because they too had seen the truth written in flame and shadow, and their loyalty now weighed against their fear. As she passed through the gate, her mind pulled her back to an older memory, one she had tried to forget, a tale told in hushed voices by an old veteran during a winter patrol, when the stars were hidden and the wind screamed like ghosts. He had spoken of a planet on the edge of the known systems, a blue world with a history of silence and violence, and inventions born not from hunger but from fear, and he had warned that one should never make a human prove his strength, because he would not fight like a warrior, but like a survivor. She had laughed then, too, but now she understood. In the underground chamber beneath the arena, Jacob stood alone before a small panel glowing with green light, the metal box resting beside him, and a hologram of her spinning slowly in the air above a crystal stand, and his fingers moved across the surface in precise motions, entering commands not for war, but for silence. He was not reporting a victory, because this had not been a battle. He was not claiming a prize, because there had been no fight. He was only writing a message for Earth, simple and short, that the Union had seen the key, and that the doors were still closed. Nothing more. A soft chime rang, and the panel dimmed, and he picked up the box again and walked toward the far end of the room where a corridor led to the diplomatic wing and the waiting chambers reserved for envoys who had completed their tasks. In that chamber sat an old man with dark skin and white hair, dressed in robes of the Earth Alliance Council, and when Jacob entered, he looked up and nodded once, then gestured to the seat across from him, and Jacob sat without speaking. The old man poured 2 cups of tea, steam rising between them, and for a moment the war, the arena, the machine, all seemed far away, like a story someone else had lived. "The Union knows now," Jacob said at last. "Yes," the old man replied, and took a slow sip. "Do you think they believe it?" They do not need to believe it, they only need to remember it, and they will because fear burns longer than pride. Jacob nodded and looked down at the cup in his hands, watching the steam curl like the memory of smoke rising from the floor of the arena, and he thought not of machine or virile, but of the silence that had followed the moment when the box had opened and the ground had obeyed. He had trained for that silence more than for any weapon. He had learned that the power of Earth was not in its fire, but in its choice not to use it. Above them in the great halls of the Union counseled the leaders of 100 worlds gathered in secret sessions, arguing in whispers, drawing new borders not on maps, but in their minds, and every mention of Earth came with a pause, a glance of silence. Some demanded to know how such a weapon had been hidden, others asked if there were more, and no one believed Jacob had acted without orders, and no one believed the machine had been the only one. In the corners of their thoughts, they wondered how many keys Earth held, and how many doors waited beneath the soil of every colony, every outpost, every forgotten moon. And in every chamber where those questions were asked, no one laughed. On the training grounds of the Cernak homeworld, instructors changed their lessons. Warriors now learned that the smallest figure might carry the largest shadow, and that silence must never again be mistaken for surrender. And in the farthest corners of the galaxy, smugglers and pirates who had once mocked Earth now erased its name from their charts and whispered of a man with a box and a weapon that did not fire until the sky itself fell quiet. Jacob remained in the chamber long after the old man had gone to tea cold and untouched his eyes on the stars beyond the window, and the box resting quietly beside him like a sleeping lion waiting for the sound that would wake it. But there was no sound, only silence. And in that silence, the galaxy turned differently. Now its voice lowered, its pride softened, because somewhere out there a quiet world had reminded them all that the most dangerous power is not the one that strikes first, but the one that waits for the moment when it no longer has to strike at all. Far below the Earth's surface, where the stars could not reach and no wind could whisper the chambers of the old Earth defense, course stretched like veins carved into stone and steel, and silence filled every hallway except for the hum of power lines older than any living soul and deeper than any map dare to go, and here the truth waited not behind glass or locks, but behind silence itself. Inside the central command vault, a long table of black iron sat beneath a ceiling made of reinforced crystal through which glowing patterns shifted like waves, and above the table hung a single light that never flickered and never dimmed, and around the table stood 7 figures, each draped in dark robes, without rank or name, each with a face unreadable and eyes that had seen more wars than history recorded, and in the center of the table was a holomap showing a live feed from the Galactic Union. Arena paused at the moment the Titan emerged from the ground behind Jacob Price. One of the figures broke the silence, his voice deep and clear like thunder behind a mountain, and he said it has been done, and the silence is broken. Another voice answered, female, sharp as ice and heavy with purpose, and she said the key has been shown, and the gate has been noticed but not opened. A third voice, older than both and slower like time itself, spoke next, and said, then we move to phase 2, and the quiet continues. The others nodded, and one of them raised a hand palm open, and light poured from the center of it, revealing an old symbol of mark that matched the stone Jacob had held in the arena, the symbol that meant Earth does not seek war, but remembers every battle. Far above in the main diplomatic wing of the Union capital, Jacob sat alone in a room with walls made of light and sound-dampening fields where no signal escaped, and no ear could listen. And on the table before him lay the same box, the same key, now still and dark, and yet the air around it seemed charged with energy, like a storm trapped in metal. A door opened, and a figure stepped inside, not a soldier, not a guard, but an old Cernak scholar dressed in the colors of peace, and holding no weapon, his skin pale silver, and his eyes cloudy from age, and yet sharp with thought. He walked with slow steps toward Jacob, and sat across from him, without speaking for several moments. Then finally he spoke, his voice soft but strong. I have studied your kind for many years, he said, and we never believed the stories, not fully, not until today. Jacob looked at him without emotion, his face still, and his hands folded before him, and he said stories are not meant to be believed until they are lived. The Cernak nodded slowly and said, once there was a time when our people thought humans were clever but fragile, loud but harmless, and we said you built machines because you feared to bleed, and you hid behind peace because you could not win war. But now I see that your machines do not fight for you. They wait for you, and your peace is not feared as patience. Jacob leaned forward slightly and said, when we built the Guardians, we did not build them to conquer. We built them to make sure no one would ever need to conquer us again. They were buried not to hide them, but to keep them asleep, because peace is not the absence of strength, it is the choice not to use it. The scholar looked at the box and asked how many more are there. Jacob answered with silence, and that silence was louder than any number could be, and the scholar understood. He stood and bowed not from protocol, but from respect, and said Earth has changed the shape of our future, not with fire, but with a whisper, and then he left the room, leaving Jacob alone once again. In the control center of the Union High Command, the leaders of all major species gathered in a secure hall beneath layers of shielding and protection, and their voices rose with fear and awe as they debated what had happened and what should be done, and how many machines like the one in the arena might exist hidden beneath the soil of Earth and its colonies. One representative from the Grella system shouted that Earth must be disarmed and stripped of its forbidden technology, but others warned that trying to disarm a species that did not declare its weapons might be the last mistake the Union ever made. They watched the footage again and again, slowing it frame by frame, tracking every movement of the machine, every step of Jacob, and every blink of the box, but the data revealed nothing more, and the truth was too simple to measure. Earth had never been weak, it had only been quiet. On Earth itself, the people moved through their lives unaware of what had happened across the stars. The news had not reached them because the Council had not allowed it, and most would never know that one of their own had reminded the galaxy that peace is not the same as helplessness. In a classroom deep in the mountains, a teacher told a story to her students about a time long ago when monsters came from the sky, and the people of Earth built protectors from stone and steel and memory, and she spoke not of war, but of waiting not of weapons, but of will, and the children listened with wide eyes and wondered if the story was true. And far from that classroom, on the other side of the world, in a lab buried beneath the sea, a second box blinked for the first time in 50 years, its light soft and blue and waiting. Because the key had been turned, the machine had risen, and now the truth had been revealed. Earth does not forget. Earth does not forgive. Earth does not boast. It watches. It waits. And when pushed too far, it remembers that silence was always its strongest weapon, and patience was always its sharpest blade, and that strength does not need to roar when it can whisper and shake the stars. The stars above the Galactic Union spun slow and silent, as if even the universe had paused to listen to what Earth had just whispered through the voice of one man and the weight of one box, and though the arena had emptied, and the crowds had gone back to their ships, and cities, a strange stillness lingered in the corridors of power, a sense that something old had awoken, and something proud had been humbled. In the upper chamber of the Union Media Towers, where news from across the galaxy was processed, and shared a dozen communication directors sat frozen in their seats, watching the footage of the Titans rise again, and again trying to make sense of what happened, trying to understand how a single human with no visible weapon had brought the most feared warrior of the Cernak to the edge of surrender without throwing a single punch. One analyst, a young Thrax named Orlin, leaned forward and whispered what that was only a warning, and his supervisor, a gray-skinned Allard with 6 eyes, did not answer, because he too had thought the same thing, and the thought would not leave him no matter how many times he played the scene. In the diplomatic wing, Jacob stood before the main X of the Union Grand Hall, with the flags of every member world waved from towering poles of crystal and light, and his eyes moved from one to the next, stopping briefly on the Earth flag, simple and small, with a single blue planet surrounded by stars, and no emblem of weapons or war, and behind the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. It was Viral walking slowly and without armor, her robes clean and dark, and her expression quiet and heavy, and when she reached Jacob, she stopped and looked at the box in his hands, and then at his face, and she said, not as a warrior, but as a voice of the people, I laughed at your toy because I thought it was all you had, and now I know it was all you needed. Jacob looked at her and said, we did not come to scare you, we came to stand among you, and when you mocked us we remained silent, not because we were afraid, but because we were listening. Viral nodded and said, I mocked your silence because I thought it meant weakness, and now I see it was patience, and that is something I must learn before I call myself a leader again. She stepped back and saluted not with the Cernak gesture of war, but with the cross palm of peace and respect, and Jacob returned the gesture, his hand steady, and his eyes unreadable. As he walked away, the reporters hidden behind the distant columns began to whisper their first headlines, their fingers moving quickly across digital pads, writing the first words that would travel to every system, every moon, and every outpost that Earth had been mocked and respected and finally feared. In a small council chamber 3 levels below the arena, the emergency committee met without cameras and without advisors, and their discussion moved like fire, jumping from fear to anger to calculation, and back again, and one delegate from the Drakkar spoke loud. And Clear Earth must be watched, they must be questioned, and their weapons cataloged and controlled. And another from Avoran shook his head, and said Earth has already shown us what they are, and what they are is not an enemy unless we force them to become one. They argued until the lights dimmed from the end of the cycle, and then they sat in silence, because they all knew something had changed not just in the Union, but in themselves, and the knowledge that one quiet world had shifted the balance without drawing a blade would haunt every future decision they made. Back on Earth, in a quiet field near a forgotten bunker, an old man walked with a cane toward a stone monument where the names of those who built the Titans were carved not as heroes, but as guardians, and he touched the name of his father and smiled softly, then turned toward the wind and whispered they finally saw it, they finally heard what we never shouted. In orbit around a red dwarf star, a small human outpost received a message with no center code and no signature, only a line of text that said the key was tested, the gate remains, and the outpost commander read it twice, then locked in the silent file, and ordered extra scans of the underground vaults. On a transport ship headed for the edge of known space, a child sat with her mother asking why the human made the ground open like magic, and the mother paused and answered, because sometimes people carry quiet things that remember what noise forgets, and the child nodded, not understanding, but remembering the words anyway. And in the deepest layer of the Union Record Department, where restricted knowledge is stored under lock and void, a new file was created labeled Earth Type Unknown, Potential Critical Threat Level Undefined. And under notes the record keeper wrote, prefers peace responds only when provoked, level of retaliation irreversible. Jacob boarded his diplomatic shuttle and placed the box in a sealed case, and the pilot, a young woman from Europa Colony, saluted him and said wordless approval as the engines warmed and when they lifted off on the surface of the Union world. He looked down once through the window and saw the arena now empty, but forever marked with the lines burned into its floor, the lines that said nothing and everything. The flight was quiet, and the stars passed without sound, and Jacob sat still with the case on his lap, and no expression on his face, because this was not a victory, it was a message, and messages did not need celebration, only memory. Back in the Union system, Vera returned to her quarters, and stood before a mirror not to admire her strength, but to see what pride had hidden from her, and she opened a terminal, and began to record a message to her people, her voice clear and strong, and she said, "We believed we were alone at the top of the ladder, and today we saw the one who held it steady." As the final reports came in from across the galaxy, every leader and general and commander who had seen the footage of the Titan rising of the human, standing still in the box, blinking its calm light, found themselves asking the same question, not how did Earth do this, but why did Earth not do it sooner? And the answer lay not in fear or in weakness, but in the one truth Earth had always known and never needed to say. Because when the laughing stops and the crowd goes silent and the strongest blade falls to dust, the quiet one who still stands is never standing alone. And now the galaxy knew that when a human brings a toy to a fight, he might just be holding the end of the war in his hand, waiting for the moment when patience becomes power and silence becomes the last laugh.